And let's go now to the next person on the phone today. Welcome to our program. Please go ahead with your call.
Hi, Chris. I have a question relating to Moses. When he was in Egypt, his 390th year in Egypt before he entered into the wilderness for 40 years.
Mhm.
Well, what I did is I noticed that if you minus 30 years from the 390, because that they're only in Egypt, you minus the 30 years of affliction, that gives you 360. So I was wondering if there's any significance to that.
Well, why would you minus it?
Because it's 390, and then if you don't, they're only afflicted at that point for 360 years, not 390 years.
Oh, because of the statement of, you mean in total by the time of the Exodus,
Right.
the statement that they were afflicted 400 years. And so, yeah, obviously the last 40 after Moses leaves, they were afflicted. So by the time he leaves, it's 360.
Right. Yeah, 390 total years, but 360 of the afflicted. So I was just wondering if that 360 was.
Maybe. But you just made me think of another relationship. A caller brought it up last night concerning Ezekiel, 390 days on the left side, 40 days on the right side, totaling 430.
Mhm.
And here with Moses, you're right. When Moses was 40, there was Israel had been in Egypt for 390 years, and he had some knowledge, probably, of the statement made to Abram in Genesis 15, that says in verse 13, and he said unto Abram, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. Now here's Moses, and he's a learned man in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, but he's also aware of his heritage, and so definitely he would have searched and found out everything he can from his mother and maybe others, and so he knows of the promise made to Abram, and there's also a knowledge of a timeline. There's a definite implication that that Moses knew about this 400-year timeline. If we go to Acts 7, let's go there. Acts chapter 7. We read in verse 22, and Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was mighty in words and in deeds. And when he was full 40 years old, now we know Moses was born in 1527 BC, and 40 years later, it's 1487 BC. And you can calculate, because we know the exact year Israel went into Egypt when Jacob was 130, and Jacob's born 2007. So it's 1877 BC when he's 130. From that point, that's when Israel entered Egypt. You go 390 years, it's 1487 BC. And then it goes on to say, when he was full 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. In verse 24, and seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended him and avenged him that was oppressed, and smote the Egyptian, for he supposed his brethren would have understood how that God by his hand would deliver them, but they understood not. And then verse 27, but he that did his neighbor wrong thrust him away, saying, who made thee a ruler and a judge over us? So that statement, who made thee a ruler and a judge over us, really is the answer to, now this is, maybe handling a couple of different things at once. I know this isn't what you were asking about, but since we're right there in Acts 13, verse 20, it says, and after that he gave unto them judges about the space of 450 years until Samuel the prophet. And when you think of it, Samuel, we know, began to judge in 1067 until 1047, and then Saul became king. And well, how can a period of about 450 years fit? I know Mr. Camping at one time, I mean, there's so many, he taught so many years, and he could have addressed this in a different way another time, but I heard him say one time that it's about 450 when you go down to Solomon. If you go from, I guess, the, I forget exactly what his starting point was, but let's say if you go from 1447 to 1047, that would be 400 years. But I think that Mr. Campion was starting in 1407 or something like that, going to Solomon, and then you have about 440. But God specifically says until Samuel the prophet, and so we could stretch it till 1047 when Samuel ended his rule as judge. But what would be about 450 years earlier? Moses in Egypt, when he is 40 years old, 1487 to 1047, you have a period 440 years, about 450, right on the mark. And here he's identified as a judge. He himself thought he would be the deliverer. Judges delivered. And it was said of him, who made thee a judge over us? So Moses is the answer to that. And it's 390 years. He thought incorrectly. You see, he's taking biblical information from Genesis 15, 400 years. And he realizes when his family, when Jacob and all Israel entered in, and it's been 390. Of course, the Jews would have kept track of the time, and we're close. And here he is, a prince in Egypt, while all the rest of his people are slaves under cruel taskmasters. So obviously, he's thinking, God will use me. That's why my circumstances are so spectacularly different, incredibly different. How could it be that a Jew has become a prince in Egypt? And it must be that God is going to use me to deliver my people. And the time is close. And Egypt's a great nation, a mighty army. Can't do it in a day. It'll probably have to happen. The process will have to get rolling. And so he begins to act in slaying the Egyptian, but miscalculation. But you see, here's the problem with those who they love to point the finger, and they themselves, many of them who are, the zealous in pointing the finger at you were wrong, you were wrong. Well, they don't distinguish between someone who is looking at blue moons or red moons and astrology and or just pulling one or two things carelessly from the Bible and establishing a date of, oh, there's been hundreds and thousands, and they exaggerate. There's been thousands of people, millions of people have set dates. Oh, they're not seriously. And everyone's lumped together. They don't distinguish between those and to men like Mr. Camping who earnestly and with great diligence studied the Bible to find scripture only that laid out timelines that pointed to specific dates, such as 1994 and May 21, 2011. And they mock and criticize and ridicule. You're wrong. Well, that could have been done to Moses, couldn't it? That could have been done to Moses. Moses, how foolish of you. How foolish of you to think that you could know the day and hour, to think that you could know the time for the deliverance of Israel from Egypt. How foolish. And he was incorrect because he didn't have certain information. God held it back. We can almost say God set him up in Genesis 15 with that statement, afflicted 400 years. And any reading it, knowing the timeline, would zero in on 10 more years from 1487, 1477, 400 years from 1877. That must be the year. And no, more information he didn't have access to until he had to flee Egypt, and he went to Haran, and we know the story, for 40 more years. 40 more years. Interesting, 1994, 2033, 40-year difference inclusively. But here is Moses. He goes to Haran, and then God comes to him and tells him, you have to go to Egypt. And it turns out Moses was correct. His earlier assumption that it had to be him, he was right. It was him. He was to be the man God used to bring deliverance to the captives in Egypt. But Moses is humbled now. Oh, no, it can't be me. I don't even speak well. And yet, you see, God, we just look at this in the timeline. Why would God reveal information and have his people think it's 1994? Why would he allow, let's put it that way, allow his people to think they will be raptured on May 21, 2011? And by the way, we were correct about that date. It was Judgment Day, the beginning of Judgment Day. We're in a prolonged Judgment Day period, so that declaration to the world was absolutely correct, except for its limits. We were incorrect about that. But anyway, why would God allow his people not to have all the information? To humble them, to prove them, to try them as he continues to reveal his word. And Moses could have said, when God came to him 40 years later, and now it's 430 years from the time they entered into Egypt, he could have said, no, God, no, I've learned my lesson. I'm not going to date set. No way. I have no interest I now know you cannot know the day and hour, and how wrong he would have been. How wrong he would have been. But he didn't, because he was a true elect child of God, and he heard the voice of God, which God's people hear from the Bible today. We hear the voice of Christ. We see the world. How blind does someone have to be who calls himself a Christian? How completely blind in heart must they be to see what has happened in the church? First of all, the tremendous apostasy worldwide, and then now for years, what is happening in the world, and not to see it as a perfect setting for the very end of the world. And on top of this, God lays out his biblical calendar, his end time judgment program, revealed with precision over top of the apostasy, horrible apostasy of all churches, and the tremendous wickedness of all nations. And the two main indicators of the end of the world that Jesus spoke about in Matthew 24. And here is a timeline that was developed, much of it in advance of the terrible apostasy, to the degree it got to the tremendous increase in wickedness worldwide, to the degree it has come. And to keep insisting with your hands over your eyes, and if you had another set plugged into your ears, no man knows a day or hour. No man knows. That's what you would have told God. And if he wouldn't have selected you as he did Moses, because Moses was a true man. He wouldn't select the multitudes in the churches and congregations who only have an outward profession. No, he came to Moses, and to Moses, he humbled him, and God moved within him to will and to do. And Moses had no choice. Where could he go? Thou hast the words of eternal life, even then as now. And so he humbly said, or got in line. That's all. He just got in line. He did his part. God has a part for every one of his people. And this is your part, Moses. Get going. And I'll even give you Aaron to be your mouthpiece. And so he goes, and God delivers his people 40 years from the time Moses thought. Yet now Moses had the correct timeline, didn't he? God revealed, now's the time, now's the year. And finally, God told him with the plagues, and especially the last plague, you will be delivered. So he knew before God brought the plague, the day and the time, the year, the month. He knew all of that in advance. We will march free out of the land of Egypt. Well, a caller brought up last night Ezekiel 4. Ezekiel lays on his one side 390 days, each day for a year, and on his right side 40 days, each day for a year. Notice how that fits the account of the Exodus and Moses. 390 years, and then he thought there'd be deliverance. And by the way, there's a tie-in. I mentioned just passing, from 1994 to 2033, 40 years. Well, here, when you go, not 390 years, but 3,900 years from the time Israel became Israel, when Jacob had his name changed in 1907, it falls on 1994. So Moses's period, that 390 years, and he thinks he's the deliverer, we could tie in to 1994. And then 40 more years testing, 40 more years that he's in the wilderness. And, you know, a different picture, the Israel's 40 years coming out of Egypt also can relate. But here, Moses is in the wilderness being tested by God. And then finally, the 390 plus 440 equal 430 to the self same day. And then deliverance. So it's, I think it would go hand in hand with Ezekiel 4.